Hey everybody, Steve Heithecker coming at you from Pyramind. Today I want to do a little bit of a tip and a technique about reverb and mixing. Right, so one of the most misunderstood, misapplied effects, I think, in all of effect land would be reverb. Reverb is a little tricky. Too much of it, everything is a wash-in verb, and it's very kind of washed out and very distant. No reverb at all, and we have incredibly dry sound and no acoustic space. I'm not saying that might never happen, but too little, too much is not going to be good. So I wanted to, before we get into the actual mixing technique, I want to talk a little bit about what reverb is, and I think that should be prefaced with what sound is, just with a touch of it, because once we understand how sound works, I think reverb is a little bit more understandable. So we like to say things like sound is a 360-degree energy emanating from the actual energy burst or sound source. It is a very dynamic life force. I like to use living and dynamic and life force when I think of sound, because I do think of that. I think of sound like fire, to be honest with you, a little bit. So if I snap my fingers, I'm going to then, from this finger snap, if we can just imagine, put on the imagine glasses for a second, that there are sound waves coming and emanating out in 360 degrees in all ways from that original energy burst. And if we can imagine those sound waves moving at about a foot a millisecond, about 1,000 feet a second, and we slow that down, so we go slow-mo with it, that we would see these waves moving until they come into contact with something. So that's a definition of sound, but then immediately we get into a definition of reverb. So once the sound emanating from that source, and based on the intensity of the energy of the original sound, hits something, now it comes into play. Now reverb comes into play, because reverb will be the persistence of sound after the direct sound. So direct sound from the snap to the wall past the ears or into the ears of the other people in this room that you're possibly not aware of. The direct sound is not the reverb, right? From point A to point B. The reverb would then be the reflections, the persistence of the sound in the room after that direct sound. Hopefully that makes sense. So another way we could say it is if when I snapped my fingers like that at the same time I exploded a bunch of golf balls that were around here magically, and they went in all different directions, you would see these golf balls start to hit all the walls in this room, and they wouldn't stick unless they were really propelled. They would bounce. That's the reflection. So it's going to go, those golf balls are going to hit those walls, they're going to bounce back, they're going to hit another wall, they're going to bounce back, they're going to hit different walls, different angles. All the room is full of golf balls. They're everywhere. It's kind of scary. And they're bouncing around until the energy diminishes. So the energy is based on that original hit from that. So sound, and then the reverb, those reflections, the early reflections that come back, early reflections, they're called, are those the first waves that return. So those are, in my mind, those would be the first responders of reverb. I like to say that one. The early reflections do give the brain, they give a bunch of information to the brain to be able to figure out the size of the room, what the shape of the room is, what the surface is covered with. So there's all this information that the brain decodes. We are like bats in a lot of ways. If you put somebody in a room with their eyes closed and had them do this, most likely they would come close to describing what the room. You put them in a really small room, put them in a bathroom, they're like, I'm in a bathroom, I know the reflections, it's really bright, it's really close. Put them in a big cave and they hear the long decay off of the reverb. So people are clever and interpret that. So in nature, sound and reverb are all around us and happen, and that definitely comes into play. That knowledge comes into play when we use this musically. So now we go and we focus on music. Why do we use reverb in music? Why do we apply it after the fact? Well, I'll answer that one first. The after the fact comes from the fact that most people do not have the budget to actually record in a beautiful, large acoustic space with brilliant natural reverb. Most people are not at the Davies Symphony Hall recording, they're in studios. So it is actually a little price prohibitive to make a recording for most people, not for everybody, in a beautiful acoustic space. So in modern music production, particularly not in classical, where we still tend to record things in those acoustic spaces, we tend to use artificial reverbs of sorts to then give back the characteristics of an acoustic space. Now, if it's artificial reverb, who's to say what that acoustic space is? It's, of course, us, because we decide that by the algorithm and the type of reverb we use. So, since most people can't afford to do this naturally, and it doesn't make sense with most people's productions, we use software, we use hardware. We still do in some studios use things like plates and springs that are actually physical, and they do exist. It's not software, it's not code. But we'll leave that away because that's also a little price prohibitive. So we added after the fact. Why do we need reverb in music? Well, dry sounds may not be what you're looking for if I just put it like that, but I'll say a better way to say it is that we close mic most things in music production to control the sound, right? So I'm going to put a microphone straight up in front of a cabinet for the guitar. I'm going to put a mic straight up in the bass cabinet. I'm going to put a mic inside the kick drum, outside the kick drum, under the snare, on top of the snare. I have mics very close to the instruments so that we get the direct sound, and only that, because a lot of times, even if people had the opportunity, the space they're recording into is not great. It's not acoustically treated and tuned to give us beautiful reflections and great reverb. So we can control that chaos by close micing everything. The consequence of close micing everything is there's no ambience in the music. You know, sometimes we definitely, and people do use room mics in drum recording, and that is straight up ambience. Like you pull it back 10, 20 feet off of the drum kit, and we are recording all those sound waves in that room reflecting, eventually getting to that mic that is way further away than that. Of course, overheads are that way as well because they record ambiences. So using reverb in a DAW lets us give back a little bit of acoustic space to anything that has been close mic'd if it has been recorded, or for samples that are actually processed dry. So many people use samples to produce with, and are sample-based producers, a better way to say that if I'm using a sample that is a dry sound, it has no space around it whatsoever. So with a piece of software or hardware reverb, I can add back a little acoustic space. Better yet, I could add a little bit of that reverb to every one of my instruments and put them all back in the same space. I mean, as I'm imagining it, even though in reality, they were never close to each other. Right? So something recorded in different studios mixed in with a bunch of samples, there's no possible way the acoustic space could be true as one space that, old school a band would have been in a room. So with reverb, we can actually tie together elements from different acoustic spaces or from no acoustic space, right? From something that's a dry microphone. All right, so with all that said, let's look at what we have. I'm going to use Reason, and I'm going to use one of my favorite comes with reverbs, meaning you don't have to pay extra for it, which is the RK7 or the RV7000 MkII. I think it is just a glorious free reverb. If you want to think free, I mean you have to pay for the program, but it comes with it. RV7000 has a number of built-in algorithms. Really good stuff. I'm going to go over real quickly, algorithms and how we would use this. So the first thought is when I'm mixing and I want to add reverb, one of the traditional ways to do is called center return. So center return means that I'm actually not inserting a reverb per track. Like I have one reverb for my guitar track, I have one reverb for my bass, one reverb for my snare, one reverb for my vocals. Center return means this, that and every program has this, by the way, so this is going to be generic information. And Reason, I find my track in the mixer, and I have 8 sends and returns in Reason, and all I have to do is find the send that my reverb is on, and I have to turn it on, right? So that's the first thing. And I'm going to make a generic audio track right next to it so we can kind of see this. So what you see is that every track will get the ability, or has the ability, to dip into that reverb. So this is where we can get that consistency back. We can glue things back together, because every track in your session could, to go to this specifically, I could turn on send 1 for every track and then give it a little reverb. The second thing about center return is the amount of the effect is controlled by you, which is pretty cool, right? So this, if it was an insert, this would be the wet dry function. But as a center return, we are literally just saying, I want to send this much of the dry signal into the reverb. So the less send, the less reverb, the more send, the more reverb, right? So we'll hear that in a second. So I can control how much. So if I use the same reverb, there's the believability, there's the glue, there's the cohesiveness coming back to all these different elements of samples and things recorded in different places. But Send and Return also speaks to conservation of resources. In the hardware days, we had to buy all those reverbs, so you didn't casually have 10 lexicons because that's $30,000. In a computer, resources still hit you because it's not money, it's processing power, right? So if I have tons of reverbs, that's all I have. I got no track, but I got tons of reverb, right? So we don't really want that. So conservation of resources and continuity in the music, two really good reasons that Send and Return is such a great idea. So every DAW will, for the most part, I'm sure there's one I'm not thinking of that doesn't, has the concept of Send and Return and inserts, right? However you want to look at that. And Send and Return is a favorite for time-based effects, which would be reverbs, delays, choruses, flanges. All right, so if we come back over to the RV here real quickly, I'm going to go ahead and dial up my drum machine here and pull this back over. So just real quickly, with what is sound, what is reverb, what is Send and Return, what is the reason that we're going to use reverb other than it sounds great. And by the way, continuity, believability, glue, sometimes we use reverb just as an effect because we want something to sound different. So I should very much say that because I do that all the time. I have a breakdown in a song and I want the singer to sound very, back in the mix, and I put on an arena reverb, with no, just pure effect pre-fader and turn down the fader, and all of a sudden I just have glorious pure reverb on a vocal. So an effect is a valid part of that as well. So RV7000. Kind of visual, so it's kind of fun to demonstrate with. Most reverbs are, in this day and age in DAWs, are algorithm-based, and the algorithms will describe the actual characteristics of the physical space. So usual suspects would be rooms, they would be halls, they would be arenas. Plate and spring would also be there, plate and spring being basically built on real devices, because plates, if you want to Google plate reverb, EMT 140 would be a good one, or spring reverbs like you would have on a guitar amp. So the algorithms describe the physical space or the mechanical function of the actual physical reverb. With the algorithm, you get a description of the space usually, like how big it's going to be. The small spaces tend to be like little rooms all the way up to something like an arena, which at 38.9, we could get it all the way up to almost 60 meters or 180 feet. So that's a pretty big room. So the reverbs, let's just give a couple examples. I'm going to go ahead and crank up the send on this one so we can really hear the effect with this. So that's an arena and small space. Now, some of these small spaces are going to sound pretty metallic when I run that much of that through there. There's a lot of ways around that, and we can also change the setting of the algorithm. Reverb can absolutely be used for special effect as well as recreating natural effects, right? It's however we want to use it with it. So typical algorithms, you would find the RV7000, you would find pretty much anywhere, including possibly echoes and delays, but also, of course, the reverse reverb, which who doesn't love a little good reverse reverb, which this has in here. So just real quickly, think about in your mind, oralize, what is the space I'm trying to put the singer in? The singer was in a small vocal booth, and I'm thinking a thought, something that's going to match with, the tonalities in the space I've created around the band. So maybe the reverb is going to be a variation of a room that you've used on the guitars and things like that. So we kind of, the audio part of visualize, oralize, think about that sound first. What do you want it to be? I know it's fun to just spin through stuff and try presets and everything, but if you have that idea first of what you're looking for, it's a little easier to get there. So we think about it, you get close to it with the algorithm. I'm not a huge fan of presets myself, so we want to be able to tweak this. So I'm just going to do a couple of the basic parameters that you get. So the first thing that comes to mind in no particular order that you're going to see on every reverb is going to be pre-delay. So the pre-delay on a reverb is the amount of time before the onset of the reverb. So I love RV7000 for a lot of things, but one is it's visual, so you can teach with it. You see that it's moving that back in time closer to that 1 second line. It's actually 250 milliseconds, which is a quarter second, but you see it move. So basically, if I don't have any pre-delay in a reverb, this is a really important concept. My reverb is affecting that sound immediately. If I back this off, make that room size a little bigger. So there's the clap, the hat, all that have that first transient, the first part of the attack of the transient, is without reverb. So I can have clarity or intelligibility. In vocals, this is huge. Give it a little pre-delay, crank it up so you get those first transients of that with a clarity, so it's intelligible, so you can hear it, and then the reverb kind of comes over everything else. So think Bobby Brown vocal production, I believe, on that, and you'll think pre-delay stuff with this. It's a great technique for vocals, but anywhere where you don't want the onset of that reverb to swim around everything and envelop it in its warm, pillowy reverbness, we use pre-delay. Number two would be the tail or the decay. So, you know, it depends on the program you're in now. Some might give you up to 20 seconds of a reverb tail. Some may give you way less than that. Reason RV7000 has infinite. That's pretty glorious stuff. I love reverb, I'm not gonna lie. Sorry, I got lost there for a second. In reverb land, the warm reverb pillowiness enveloped me. All right, so the decay time is a big deal. So in general, we like to control reverbs very precisely. If you just let a sound go through a verb with a 10-second tail, it's basically the reverb is saying, hey, look at me, I'm here, I'm the reverb, don't listen to anything else. So long tails on reverb, special effects, sound design, any post-production where you're matching the motivation on the screen. In music production, those long tails get in the way of all the other sounds and make things a little bit muddy. So we like very controlled reverbs. I'm not saying you never have the long tail in a reverb, don't misunderstand me, but it's whatever's appropriate for it. Just don't do I think the amateur mistake, I hate to say it that way, would be just crank up the verb so I can really hear it, and now it's too much of it, right? So it kind of depends on what you're doing, case by case basis, but I think control those decay times. So whether it's called a reverb tail, decay time, we like this idea of fitting the reverb in the mix. The next part of this, I will tie that together with this, would be EQing the reverb. If you leave the reverb un-EQ'd, it literally wants to swallow up with long enough of a tail anyway the rest of the sounds in your track. We can't have that because it's full bandwidth. So quite often we would bandpass this with it. So I'm going to turn on the EQ. The different reverbs have different EQs with it, but you can see with my parametric here, I actually do have the ability to go and remove things. Now, a lot of times you will see a shelf EQ, so it literally, or a high pass and a low pass. We put those together, we get a band pass. I love to band pass that because I can actually then, and here's a shelf, by the way. So at this point, I'm getting rid of the lows. Why do we get rid of low frequencies and reverbs? Mud. That is a real simple one. If you control those real lows on big sounds, you're going to be able to control the overall saturation of that frequency. If it's too bright, all you'll hear will be the bright edge of the reverb. So you really do want to EQ and maybe bandpass that so that there's only reverb. The only frequency of the reverb is what you want that will fit into a track. This could be a game changer in and of itself for your mixing. If you were just letting reverb just have its way with everything, so to speak, control that reverb's frequency and make it fit into the mix. So my decay time, the tail of the reverb, however we want to say it, and also EQing that reverb will really let us be the master of that space, right? How big is that space? Short decay times also, I'll switch this back to reverb. Short decay times also are a great way to put a sense of space around a sound. Sometimes it's even 1 millisecond. This is in MIDI, so we're not seeing the actual time frame. I can kind of see it here, how quick that'll hit. That's the pre-delay a little bit, but I can kind of see how fast I can have this. Not real fast. A lot of times decay can be turned down to a millisecond, which means that instead of there being a tail in that and a huge distance perspective, that it just makes the space a little bit bigger. So we like really short decay times. Try that on a vocal track, put a really short decay time on an algorithm, and you'll hear the vocal sound bigger. Right, that's a great trick to do that. So decay time, really big deal. The EQ, in the EQing, of course, dampen would be, in the EQ right here, would be ways to control or damp those frequencies. So there's that brighter edge with that. I'm going to turn off that EQ. So as this runs through there, I can actually control a little bit of that tonality with these features, which are definitely baked in for everything I was saying. Most EQs have something like this. So the EQ, how we control the frequency of a reverb is huge. That might be different on other reverbs. And by the way, if your reverb does not have an EQ, put an EQ after it on the aux track or wherever, however you're sending it, just put an EQ after it, right? That's not a big deal. The last part of this, I would say, would be real quickly diffusion. So you can see this one visually. So diffusion is also called smearing or blurring, and it means that it's how the reflections come back. Do they come back as one unified sound, or do they come back as a number of individual hits? So you kind of see with this one, as I take the diffusion down to 0, that those being my reflections, I might actually hear them, and that's like a delay. In that sense, like a ping pong or a multi-tap delay, that I'm actually getting returns at different times from different places. Well, like I said, if the brain can't really hear differences under 20 milliseconds. So, we like to smear things together in general. The brain kind of does it anyway, so that we hear everything coming back as one sound as opposed to a bunch of different things. If we heard every reflection of a reverb differently in real life, it'd probably drive us crazy. We hear it as, ooh, here's the reflections collectively together. So diffusion will let you pronounce that or not. There are times when you may want to hear what it sounds like to actually have those reflections, and I can really crank the diffusion here and put my decay up a little bit. You can start to hear smooth, and you can hear those differences with it. Let me just make that a little bigger. Now you start to hear a number of things. If I put this on an echo algorithm, so diffused, not diffused. So that exaggerates the point, but I think it actually does make the point with it, that even though in reverb you don't hear it as defined as that, it does the same thing in the echo that is here. So to round it up real quickly, reverb in nature, we hear it, it's part of sound. The only place we wouldn't hear it would be an anechoic chamber. Part of the trick of mixing with it is that everyone is used to reverb because it's a part of everyday life. You hear it everywhere you are, whether it's pronounced or not, whether you're in a dead room or a live room, but it is there. So remember that it can be used to bring a sense of space to everything, but it could also be used as an effect. Think about using it as center return as opposed to an insert. I think that'll make everybody's life easier. And then think about decay time. Think about Predelay, think about diffusion, think about the algorithm describing the actual shape and things like that. And I think you have a good start with this. Practice, start looking at your tracks a little bit differently, and go through these concepts that we've talked about on a solo track, like I was using the clap sound. I like to, like a single ping of something, and that way I can definitely get in and hear what's happening as opposed to trying to do it right away in the mix, where I'm kind of trying to fight through the other sounds with it. So the more you learn about reverb and how reverb works in general, believe me, this will pay off in your mix and help you be a better mixer. Take care.